In the annals of history, few leaders have employed such methodical and ruthless tactics against their political rivals as Adolf Hitler. Behind the public speeches and propaganda of the Third Reich lay a terrifying reality, a calculated campaign to silence opposition through intimidation, imprisonment, and elimination. Today, we pull back the curtain on the lesser-known aspects of Hitler's rise to absolute power, tactics so extreme that they forever changed our understanding of political tyranny. What you're about to learn isn't just history, it's a warning. The systematic destruction of political opposition in Nazi Germany didn't happen overnight. It evolved gradually, each step more extreme than the last, as democratic safeguards eroded and voices of dissent were silenced one by one. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a democratic nation transformed into a one-party dictatorship in just 18 months, and the horrifying price paid by those who dared to stand in Hitler's way. Hitler's path to power didn't begin with concentration camps and mass elimination. It started with something far more insidious, a carefully orchestrated campaign of intimidation and political maneuvering. In the early 1920s, as the Nazi Party was still in its infancy, Hitler recognized the power of controlled violence. The Sturmabteilung, or SA, better known as the Brown Shirts, became his tool for disrupting political meetings of opponents. These weren't random acts of violence, but calculated displays meant to create fear and confusion. Communist and social democratic gatherings would suddenly be interrupted by dozens of brown shirts, often resulting in brutal beatings of attendees. The message was clear: supporting opposition parties came with physical risk, but Hitler was clever enough to maintain plausible deniability. While privately encouraging the violence, he publicly presented himself as a law and order candidate, someone who could end the very chaos his supporters were creating. This dual strategy, creating fear while promising security, proved remarkably effective in a Germany still reeling from World War I and economic depression. And here's what many don't realize: Hitler came to power legally. He wasn't elected outright as chancellor. He was appointed by President Hindenburg in January 1933, after a series of failed governments. At the time, many conservatives believed they could control Hitler by surrounding him with traditional cabinet members. They were catastrophically wrong. 4 weeks after Hitler became chancellor, on February 27, 1933, the German parliament building, the Reichstag, erupted in flames. The timing couldn't have been more convenient for Hitler's ambitions. Elections were scheduled just 6 days later, and the Nazi Party had been struggling to secure an absolute majority. Within hours of the fire, a young Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe was arrested at the scene. For Hitler, this was a political gift, immediate proof that communists were plotting to overthrow the government. What many historians now believe, however, is that the fire was either set by the Nazis themselves or, at minimum, exploited opportunistically by them. Regardless of who lit the match, Hitler's response was immediate and devastating. The very next day, Hitler persuaded President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties indefinitely. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to assembly, all vanished overnight. Police could search homes without warrants and confiscate property at will. Most critically, the decree allowed for the indefinite detention of anyone deemed to be a political threat. Within 24 hours, thousands of Communist Party leaders and officials were arrested. The timing was no coincidence. With the Communist Party effectively decapitated just days before the election, Hitler had eliminated his most powerful political rival in one swift move. But the true masterwork of political elimination was still to come. In March 1933, with communist representatives either arrested or in hiding, Hitler presented the enabling act to what remained of the Reichstag. This seemingly bureaucratic piece of legislation would prove to be democracy's death warrant in Germany. The act would grant Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws without the involvement of the Reichstag for 4 years. In essence, it would transform Germany from a democracy into a legal dictatorship with a single vote. To ensure its passage, the Nazi Party surrounded the parliament building with SA and SS troops. The message to the remaining representatives was unmistakable: vote against Hitler at your peril. Even with these intimidation tactics, Hitler needed a 2/3 majority. The Center Party, a Catholic conservative group, held the deciding votes. Their leader, Ludwig Kaas, ultimately led his party to support the act after receiving vague promises about protecting church rights. With the enabling act passed, Hitler could now rule by decree. He had achieved a dictator's ultimate goal. His tyranny was now perfectly legal. No further elections would be needed. No legislation could be challenged in court. The remaining political parties must have sensed what was coming next. By summer 1933, Hitler moved against all remaining political parties. The Social Democratic Party was banned in June. By July, the Center Party dissolved itself under pressure. Other smaller parties followed suit. By July 14, 1933, less than 6 months after Hitler became chancellor, Germany was officially a one-party state. The Nazi Party was now the only legal political organization in the country, but outlawing parties was just the beginning. Hitler needed to ensure that no opposition could reorganize or operate underground. This meant targeting individual political figures with a terrifying thoroughness. Social Democrats and Communists faced the harshest treatment. Thousands were sent to newly established concentration camps at Dachau and elsewhere. These weren't yet the death camps of the Holocaust, but they were brutally effective at removing political opposition from public life. Even those who escaped Germany weren't safe. Nazi intelligence tracked down political exiles across Europe. In one notorious case, prominent anti-Nazi writer Theodor Lessing was tracked to Czechoslovakia, where he was attacked and fatally wounded by Nazi agents in August 1933. Let's pause here to consider the breathtaking speed of these events. In January 1933, Germany was a democracy with multiple political parties. By August, it was a one-party state where opposing Hitler meant imprisonment, or worse, and we're just getting started. By 1934, Hitler had eliminated organized external opposition, but he still faced challenges from within his own movement, particularly from the SA leadership under Ernst Röhm. The SA had been essential to Hitler's rise to power. With over 3 million members, it dwarfed the regular German army. Röhm had been one of Hitler's earliest supporters and closest allies, but he had become a liability for several reasons. First, Röhm envisioned the SA as the core of a new German military, which alarmed the traditional army leadership whose support Hitler needed. Second, Röhm and many SA leaders advocated for a second revolution, one that would be more socialist in nature, threatening Hitler's alliances with industrialists and conservatives. Perhaps most dangerously, Röhm controlled a paramilitary force larger than the German army and had the loyalty of millions. For a paranoid leader like Hitler, this could not be tolerated. Hitler's solution was as decisive as it was brutal. On June 30th, 1934, a night that would become known as the Night of the Long Knives, SS units under Heinrich Himmler's command launched coordinated attacks against SA leadership. Röhm was arrested personally by Hitler. After refusing the opportunity to take his own life, he was executed in his cell the following day. The purge extended far beyond the SA leadership, however. Conservative critics like former Chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and his wife were killed in their home. Former Bavarian Commissioner Gustav von Kahr, who had opposed Hitler's beer hall putsch in 1923, was found hacked to death in a swamp. The exact death toll remains unknown, with estimates ranging from 85 to several hundred. What's particularly notable is that Hitler didn't hide these actions. He boasted about them. In a speech to the Reichstag, he declared himself the supreme judge of the German people, claiming the legal right to eliminate anyone he deemed a threat to national security. The German legal establishment, already compromised, retroactively legalized the purge with a one-paragraph decree. The Night of the Long Knives sent a chilling message. Not even being Hitler's longtime ally provided protection. Absolute loyalty was the only currency that mattered in the Third Reich. With legal opposition eliminated and internal rivals purged, Hitler's regime established a more permanent solution for political dissidents: the concentration camp system. Dachau, established in March 1933, became the model. Initially created to hold political prisoners, the early concentration camps weren't designed as extermination centers, but as detention facilities where political opponents could be isolated from society and subjected to re-education through forced labor and systematic brutality. The conditions were deliberately harsh. Prisoners were subjected to arbitrary punishment, inadequate nutrition, and backbreaking labor. Many did not survive the experience. Those who did were often broken in body and spirit. What many don't realize is that years before Jews, Roma, and other groups were targeted for mass destruction, political prisoners wore their own colored triangles in the camps. Communists and Social Democrats wore red triangles. Other political prisoners wore red triangles inverted to form a simple P. By 1939, tens of thousands of political prisoners had passed through the camp system. Many never returned. Those who survived and were eventually released served another purpose. They carried the terrifying reality of the camps back to their communities, spreading fear that silenced further dissent. The message was clear: oppose Hitler, even privately, and you might disappear into this system of deliberate cruelty. In 1934, Hitler established a new legal entity that would become synonymous with political persecution: the People's Court, Volksgerichtshof. Created specifically to try cases of political offenses, the People's Court operated outside normal legal constraints. Defendants had limited access to legal representation. Evidence obtained through coercion was admissible, and the judges were selected specifically for their Nazi loyalty rather than legal expertise. The most infamous judge, Roland Freisler, who presided over the court during its most active period, was known for his shouting tirades against defendants and predetermined guilty verdicts. Between 1934 and 1945, the People's Court handed down more than 16,000 death sentences, not just to active resistors, but to anyone who expressed doubt about Nazi leadership or policies. Even telling a political joke could lead to a death sentence if it was deemed to undermine military morale. Consider the case of Otto and Elise Hampel, a working-class couple who began leaving handwritten postcards around Berlin, urging resistance after Elise's brother was killed in France. For this minimal act of defiance, simply placing cards in public places questioning the war, they were tried before the People's Court, sentenced to death, and beheaded. The psychological impact of the People's Court extended far beyond those who actually faced trial. Germans knew that neighbors, colleagues, or even family members might report any careless political comment. This created a society of self-censorship, where political dissent vanished not just from public discourse, but from private conversation as well. By 1944, with Germany facing likely defeat, a group of military officers and civil servants launched the most serious attempt to remove Hitler from power. Led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the conspirators planned to assassinate Hitler, take control of the government, and seek peace with the Allies. The July 20th plot wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It represented the culmination of years of growing disillusionment within the German military leadership and civil service. Many of the conspirators had been part of earlier, aborted plots. Some had been horrified by the atrocities they'd witnessed on the Eastern Front. Others recognized that Hitler was leading Germany to total destruction and sought to salvage what remained of their country before it was too late. What's particularly notable about the July 20th conspirators is that many had initially supported Hitler. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben had been a Nazi sympathizer. General Ludwig Beck had helped Hitler rebuild the German army. Their evolution from supporters to active resistors illustrates how dramatically Hitler's leadership had alienated even those who once believed in him. On that fateful Thursday afternoon, Stauffenberg arrived at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia for a military briefing. He carried a briefcase containing a British-made plastic explosive equipped with a silent time fuse. After activating the bomb, Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the conference table, positioning it as close to Hitler as possible. Stauffenberg then excused himself, claiming he needed to make an urgent phone call. Minutes later, at approximately 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonated. The blast destroyed the conference room, killing 4 people and injuring many others. But through what some might call a tragic twist of fate, Hitler survived with only minor injuries. Someone had inadvertently moved the briefcase to the other side of a heavy oak table support, which shielded Hitler from the full force of the explosion. Unaware that Hitler had survived, Stauffenberg witnessed the explosion from a distance and immediately flew back to Berlin to implement Operation Valkyrie, the coup's second phase. For a few critical hours, the conspirators believed they had succeeded. They began issuing orders to arrest SS leaders and seize control of government buildings in Berlin. But by evening, news of Hitler's survival had reached Berlin. With their central premise, Hitler's death, now invalidated, the coup rapidly unraveled. Loyal Nazi forces quickly regained control. Stauffenberg and several key conspirators were arrested at the War Ministry and executed by firing squad in the courtyard that very night under the headlights of military vehicles. Had the conspirators succeeded, history might have taken a dramatically different course. They planned to immediately seek peace with the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviet Union, potentially avoiding the total defeat and division of Germany that followed Hitler's fall the next year. Hitler's vengeance for this betrayal went beyond anything previously seen in the Third Reich. In the following months, nearly 5,000 Germans were executed in connection with the plot. The Gestapo used the conspiratorial network as a pretext to arrest anyone with even tenuous opposition connections. The show trials that followed were particularly grotesque spectacles of vengeance. Presided over by the fanatical Roland Freisler in the People's Court, defendants were denied belts and suspenders, so they would have to hold up their pants while standing before the court, a deliberate humiliation. Freisler would scream insults at the accused, calling them traitors and cowards, while allowing no meaningful defense. The trial of prominent conspirators was filmed for Hitler's personal viewing. In the footage, Freisler can be seen berating distinguished military officers and diplomats as they stand stoically facing certain death. One of the most dignified was Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, who, despite being forced to hold his pants up and enduring Freisler's tirade, maintained his composure throughout the mockery of justice. The method of execution ordered by Hitler revealed his unquenchable thirst for revenge. Conspirators weren't simply shot, or even given the relative dignity of the guillotine. Instead, they were hung from meat hooks with piano wire, a method deliberately chosen to prolong their suffering. The executions were filmed at Hitler's request, providing him with footage he reportedly watched repeatedly. Their families didn't escape punishment either. Under a policy known as Sippenhaft, kin liability, relatives of conspirators, including children, were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The wife, children, and even extended family members of Stauffenberg were taken into clan arrest. His older children were forced to change their surname. Even infants were seized and placed in orphanages under new identities. What made the July 20th plot particularly significant was that it demonstrated Hitler's paranoia had reached new heights. In its aftermath, military officers were required to give the Nazi salute rather than the traditional military salute, a symbolic demonstration that loyalty to Hitler personally superseded all other allegiances. The military conspiracy also gave Hitler the pretext to purge the officer corps of anyone suspected of lacking absolute loyalty, replacing competent leadership with Nazi ideologues at a time when Germany faced imminent military defeat. The aftermath of the plot revealed the true nature of Hitler's regime in its final phase, a paranoid tyranny held together solely by fear and violence, willing to consume even its own military leadership rather than tolerate any challenge to Hitler's absolute authority. By targeting the military leadership so brutally, Hitler effectively decapitated Germany's last remaining institutional power center that might have acted as a check on his authority. As we've seen, Hitler's elimination of political opposition followed a clear pattern, one that began with intimidation, progressed to legal persecution, and culminated in physical elimination. Each step was calculated to remove barriers to absolute power while maintaining a veneer of legality. The effectiveness of these methods was undeniable. By 1939, organized political opposition inside Germany had been virtually eliminated. Individual acts of resistance continued, the White Rose student group distributing leaflets, churchmen like Martin Niemöller speaking out, workers staging small acts of sabotage, but coordinated resistance was almost impossible. This systematic destruction of opposing voices, the country that had been a center of philosophical debate, political diversity, and intellectual freedom, became a monolithic state where conformity was the only safe option. Universities that had pioneered critical thinking became propaganda centers. Newspapers that had represented diverse viewpoints became mere mouthpieces for state ideology. The human cost of this transformation can be measured not just in those directly eliminated, but in the millions whose talents, ideas, and contributions were suppressed by fear. How many innovations, artistic creations, and scientific advancements were lost because their creators feared expressing any thought that might deviate from approved ideology? Perhaps most disturbing is how many ordinary citizens became complicit in maintaining this system. The Nazi regime created elaborate reward systems for informants. Denouncing a neighbor as politically unreliable could result in tangible benefits. Perhaps their apartment or job would become available. This mercenary aspect of political persecution created a society where ethical considerations were subordinated to personal advantage. For those who resisted, despite the risks, the consequences were severe. Consider the case of Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Resistance Group, university students who distributed anti-Nazi leaflets in 1942 to 43. When caught, they faced Freisler's People's Court and were executed within days of their arrest. Sophie was was just 21 years old. Her last words before beheading were reportedly, "Such a fine, sunny day and I have to go. What does my death matter if through us, thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" The story of the White Rose reminds us that even in the darkest periods, some individuals maintain their moral compass. Despite creating one of history's most effective systems of repression, the Nazi regime never completely eliminated dissent. Small acts of resistance continued throughout the Third Reich. Workers slowing production, clergy giving sermons with veiled criticism, neighbors hiding those at risk. The speed with which this happened remains perhaps the most disturbing aspect. Germany transformed from a flawed but functioning democracy to a one-party dictatorship in less than 2 years. Political plurality, free press, independent courts, all vanished with a rapidity that shocked even contemporary observers. This historical lesson teaches us that democracy's guardrails can fail quickly when systematically attacked. Constitutional protections mean little without individuals willing to defend them. In the Nazi case, too many potential defenders calculated their personal interests rather than standing on principle. By the time the full threat was evident, organized resistance had become nearly impossible. Modern scholars debate whether contemporary democracies have sufficient safeguards against similar authoritarian tactics. While constitutional structures differ, human psychology remains constant. The same appeals to fear, the same willingness to trade liberty for security, the same vulnerability to demonization of others that Hitler exploited still exist in every society. The German experience under Hitler also demonstrates the danger of normalizing gradual erosions of democratic norms. Each step in Hitler's elimination of opposition, from the Reichstag fire decree to the Enabling Act to the Night of Long Knives, was justified as an exceptional measure responding to extraordinary circumstances. Each was presented as temporary, none were. Yet perhaps the most important lesson is that resistance, even when ultimately unsuccessful, matters profoundly. Those who opposed Hitler, from politicians who voted against the Enabling Act to the July 20th conspirators to ordinary Germans who helped their persecuted neighbors, maintained the possibility of a different Germany. Their actions, preserved in historical memory, provided moral foundations for the democratic society that emerged after 1945. When we study the systematic elimination of political opposition under Hitler, we're not just learning about historical events. We're gaining insights into the fragility of democratic institutions and the courage required to defend them. In doing so, we honor both the victims of Nazi persecution and those who risked everything to resist it. But Hitler's elimination of political rivals wasn't accomplished through violence alone. The Nazi propaganda apparatus, headed by Joseph Goebbels, played a crucial role in delegitimizing opposition before it was physically removed. One of Goebbels' first acts after the Nazis came to power was to establish the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Through this organization, he gained control over radio, press, cinema, and other forms of communication. Opposition politicians were portrayed not as legitimate alternatives, but as traitors working against German interests. Communist leaders were depicted as agents of Moscow. Social Democrats were blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I through the stab-in-the-back myth. Center-party politicians were characterized as puppets of Vatican influence. By controlling the narrative so completely, the Nazi regime ensured that when opposition leaders were arrested or worse, much of the public had already been conditioned to view them as enemies deserving punishment, rather than political figures expressing legitimate alternatives. This coupling of physical repression with propaganda manipulation created a particularly effective system for eliminating political resistance. Goebbels understood that effective propaganda required control of all information channels. Within months of Hitler's appointment as chancellor, the Nazi regime had either shut down or taken editorial control of approximately 175 newspapers. By 1939, the number of independent newspapers in Germany had decreased from over 4,700 to fewer than 1,000. All operating under strict censorship guidelines. Radio became a particularly powerful tool. Goebbels recognized its unique ability to reach millions simultaneously with the same message. The regime subsidized the production of affordable people's receivers, Volksempfänger, designed specifically to receive only domestic broadcasts. By 1939, over 70% of German households owned a radio, one of the highest rates in the world. These radios delivered a steady stream of propaganda into German homes. Political speeches, carefully crafted news reports, and entertainment programs all reinforce the same themes. The wisdom of Hitler's leadership, the threat posed by enemies both external and internal, and the necessity of national unity against these threats. The demonization of political opposition was a constant theme. Goebbels understood that eliminating rivals physically wasn't enough. Their ideas had to be discredited as well. Communist ideology wasn't presented as an alternative economic theory, but as a Jewish conspiracy to destroy German culture. Social democratic policies weren't debated on their merits, but portrayed as responsible for Germany's defeat in World War I and subsequent economic collapse. This propaganda barrage created a psychological environment where many Germans viewed the arrest of opposition leaders not as political persecution, but as necessary security measures against dangerous elements. When Ernst Thälmann, leader of the German Communist Party, was arrested in 1933, Nazi propaganda portrayed it not as the elimination of a political rival, but as the neutralization of a Moscow agent planning violent revolution. Film proved particularly effective for emotionally charged propaganda. Movies like The Eternal Jew and Hitler Junge Quecks didn't present rational arguments against political opposition, but triggered visceral emotional responses. The latter film portrayed communists as murderers of innocent Hitler Youth members, further cementing the association between political opposition and criminality. Particularly insidious was how Nazi propaganda exploited real historical traumas. Germany's defeat in World War I and the economic hardships that followed created genuine grievances that Goebbels masterfully redirected toward political scapegoats. Once these opposition groups were thoroughly demonized in public consciousness, their physical elimination met with significantly less resistance than it might have otherwise. The effectiveness of this propaganda strategy reveals an important lesson. Attacks on democratic institutions often begin with attacks on shared truth. By controlling information and systematically delegitimizing alternative voices, authoritarian regimes can create an environment where oppressive measures seem justified or even necessary to many citizens. The elimination of Hitler's political rivals succeeded not just because of SA violence or Gestapo efficiency, but because propaganda had prepared the public to accept or even support these actions. While much attention focuses on how Hitler targeted prominent political rivals, equally important was the systematic elimination of local-level opposition. In towns and villages across Germany, local Nazi Party members compiled lists of political opponents, social democratic city councilors, communist labor organizers, liberal newspaper editors, and others who might organize resistance. After the Enabling Act passed, these lists became action plans. Local police, often working with SA units, conducted coordinated raids. In many small towns, the entire leadership of opposition parties disappeared overnight into protective custody. This grassroots elimination was particularly effective because it removed the organizational infrastructure necessary for political opposition. Without local organizers, even citizens who disagreed with Nazi policies had no way to channel their dissent into effective action. By the end of 1933, an estimated 150,000 political opponents had been detained across Germany. While some prominent leaders made headlines, thousands of local political figures simply vanished from public life with little notice, a systematic decapitation of potential resistance at the community level. The mechanics of this local elimination followed a consistent pattern across Germany. The process typically began with the appointment of Nazi Party members as police chiefs in towns and cities. These new police leaders would then cooperate with local SA units to identify and target opposition figures. Particularly important was the role of the newly created auxiliary police, Hilfspolizei, composed primarily of SA and SS members. These auxiliary police operated outside normal legal constraints and were used specifically for political arrests. By March 1933, there were approximately 25,000 auxiliary police in Prussia alone, creating a parallel security force explicitly tasked with eliminating political opposition. The crackdown targeted local political infrastructure comprehensively. Labor unions, crucial organizing centers for workers' resistance, were particular targets. On May 2, 1933, SA and SS units occupied union offices across Germany, confiscating assets and arresting leaders. The independent labor movement, which had been a cornerstone of resistance to earlier authoritarian tendencies in Germany, was eliminated in a single day. Local newspapers faced similar coordinated attacks. Editors of social democratic or liberal publications were arrested, printing equipment confiscated, and publishing licenses revoked. By removing these community voices, the Nazi regime eliminated forums where opposition views might be expressed and organized. Community gathering places were also systematically targeted. Workers' clubs, cooperative societies, and cultural associations affiliated with opposition parties were either shut down or brought under Nazi control. These meeting places had provided both social cohesion and organizational infrastructure for political alternatives. With their elimination, the physical spaces where resistance might develop disappeared. The local elimination campaign extended beyond formal political organizations to include influential community figures who might become focal points for opposition. Teachers known for liberal or progressive views were dismissed. Local clergy who expressed concerns about Nazi policies faced harassment. Doctors or lawyers who had supported opposition parties found their professional licenses revoked. Perhaps most effective was how the regime inserted Nazi party members into positions of local authority as mayors, school principals, hospital administrators, and other community leadership roles. These appointments created a comprehensive surveillance network where expressions of political dissent could be immediately identified and punished. The effectiveness of this grassroots elimination becomes clear when comparing Nazi Germany to other authoritarian regimes. In countries where dictatorship was imposed primarily from above, resistance often continued at local levels despite repression of national leadership. In Nazi Germany, by contrast, the comprehensive elimination of local opposition created a vacuum where organized resistance struggled to find footing. What makes this aspect of Hitler's campaign against political rivals particularly relevant today is its reminder that democratic institutions depend not just on national structures, but on thousands of local organizations and individuals. When these local democratic actors are systematically targeted, resistance becomes exponentially more difficult to organize. The grassroots elimination also helps explain why resistance to Nazi rule remained fragmented throughout the Third Reich. Without local organizational networks, those opposed to Hitler had no way to find each other, coordinate activities, or develop shared strategies. The few resistance groups that did emerge tended to be isolated cells with limited ability to expand their influence. Hitler's campaign against political rivals didn't stop at Germany's borders. As thousands of opponents fled into exile, the Nazi regime developed sophisticated methods for tracking and neutralizing them abroad. The Gestapo established a special department, Department 4E, specifically tasked with monitoring émigré communities. They infiltrated exile groups, intercepted mail, and worked with sympathizers in foreign countries to maintain surveillance on German political refugees. In several notorious cases, they went beyond surveillance to direct action. In 1938, journalist Berthold Jacob was kidnapped from Switzerland and brought back to Germany. In 1942, Carlo Tresca, an Italian-American who had been outspoken against fascism, was assassinated in New York City, an operation many historians attribute to Nazi agents. After Germany began occupying neighboring countries, political exiles who had fled Hitler found themselves in danger once again. The Nazi regime had kept meticulous records of who had fled and where. As German forces moved into Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, and other countries, they brought these lists with them. Many exiled politicians who had escaped the first wave of persecution were captured during these occupations and sent to concentration camps. Former Reichstag members who had voted against the Enabling Act were particularly targeted, with the Nazi leadership holding long memories of those who had opposed them democratically. By the later war years, Hitler's approach to political opposition had evolved from imprisonment to systematic elimination. As the tide of war turned against Germany, the regime's paranoia about internal enemies intensified. Political prisoners in concentration camps, some of whom had been detained since 1933, faced increasingly brutal treatment. Many were transferred to extermination camps or executed as the war situation deteriorated. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces approached Germany, special SS units were dispatched to camps, specifically to eliminate high-value political prisoners before they could be liberated. In April 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender, a group of prominent political prisoners, including former Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, Pastor Martin Niemöller, and former military chief Kurt von Schleicher's brother, were executed at Flossenbürg concentration camp. This final wave of eliminations served no military or strategic purpose. It was the culmination of Hitler's pathological determination to destroy anyone who had ever opposed him, a vendetta pursued literally to the last days of the Third Reich. The evolution toward total elimination began around 1942, as Nazi leadership recognized that Germany might not win the war. With this realization came increasing paranoia about internal enemies who might capitalize on military setbacks to challenge Hitler's rule. Political prisoners who had been held for years in concentration camps suddenly faced greater danger. The Night and Fog Decree of December 1941 formalized a policy of making political opponents literally disappear. Under this policy, suspected resistance members in occupied territories were to be transported to Germany in secret, with no information provided to their families about their fate or whereabouts. The goal, as stated in the decree itself, was to create efficient and enduring intimidation by leaving families in a state of uncertainty. The death rate among political prisoners rose dramatically during this period. At Flossenbürg concentration camp, for example, of the approximately 30,000 political prisoners who passed through, an estimated 10,000 died. Many of these deaths occurred in the final phase of the war. Similar patterns appeared at other camps, with political prisoners often assigned to the most dangerous labor commandos or subjected to particularly harsh treatment. As Allied forces approached German territory, Hitler became obsessed with eliminating high-value political prisoners before they could be liberated. The most notorious example came in April 1945, weeks before Germany's surrender, when a group of prominent prisoners at Flossenbürg were hastily tried by an SS flying court-martial and executed. Among them was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, former head of German military intelligence who had been implicated in resistance activities, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian who had opposed Nazism on moral grounds. What makes these final eliminations particularly revealing of Hitler's character is their complete lack of strategic value. By April 1945, Germany's defeat was inevitable. These killings couldn't affect the war's outcome or preserve the Nazi regime. They represented pure vengeance, Hitler's determination that his opponents should not outlive his regime. This vindictiveness extended to the families of political opponents as well. Under the Sippenhaft policy, relatives of those implicated in resistance activities faced arrest and imprisonment. In the final months of the war, as conditions in camps deteriorated, these family members, guilty of no crime beyond their family connections, faced increasing danger. The case of the Goerdeler family illustrates this cruelty. Karl Goerdeler, former mayor of Leipzig, had been a key civilian figure in the resistance network behind the July 20th plot. After the plot failed, the Gestapo arrested not just Goerdeler, who was executed in February 1945, but also his wife, his two daughters, his sister, his brother and sister-in-law, and even more distant relatives. None had been involved in resistance activities. Their only crime was their relationship to Goerdeler. Workers in factories engaged in slowdowns, deliberate mistakes in production, and other forms of passive resistance, despite plant-level surveillance by Nazi labor organizations. Each of these resistors made a conscious choice to oppose tyranny despite knowing the likely consequences. Their courage provides an important moral counterweight to the success of Hitler's campaign against political opposition. Among the most remarkable resistance stories is that of the Red Orchestra, Rote Kapelle, a network of anti-Nazi Germans who provided intelligence to the Allies and distributed anti-Nazi literature. Led by Haro Schulze-Boysen, a Luftwaffe officer, and Arvid Harnack, an economist in the Ministry of Economics, the group included approximately 150 members from diverse backgrounds: intellectuals, artists, workers, and military officers. What makes their resistance particularly notable was its durability. Even after the Gestapo had arrested some members, others continued their activities despite knowing they had been compromised. When finally captured in 1942, many Red Orchestra members faced show trials before the Reich military court. The sentences were predictably harsh. Approximately 50 members were executed, often by hanging from meat hooks at Plötzensee prison. The case of Georg Elser represents perhaps the most determined individual resistance to Hitler. A carpenter with no significant political affiliation, Elser decided that Hitler had to be removed to prevent war. Working alone over several months in 1939, he painstakingly installed a time bomb in a beer hall where Hitler was scheduled to speak on November 8th. The bomb detonated precisely as planned, killing 8 people. but Hitler had left the venue early. Elzer was captured trying to cross into Switzerland and spent the remainder of his life in concentration camps before being executed in the final days of the war. The White Rose Student Resistance Group, though short-lived, demonstrated that even young people raised under Nazi education could develop moral opposition to the regime. Led by siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl and Professor Kurt Huber at Munich University, the group distributed leaflets condemning Nazi atrocities and calling on Germans to resist. Though active for less than a year before their arrest in 1943, their moral clarity, particularly as expressed in their interrogations and trial, provides a powerful counter-narrative to claims that Germans were uniformly cowed by Nazi terror. Religious resistance took various forms. The most organized opposition came from the Confessing Church, a faction of German Protestantism that rejected Nazi attempts to control church affairs. Leaders like Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer spoke out against the regime's policies, particularly its anti-Semitism and euthanasia program. Though not primarily political in their opposition, their moral stance represented a significant challenge to Nazi claims of representing Christian German values. Catholic resistance, while less organized nationally, manifested in individual acts of courage. Bishop August von Galen's sermons against the Nazi euthanasia program in 1941 were so powerful that the regime temporarily halted the program rather than arrest the popular bishop. Father Bernhard Lichtenberg, provost of St. Hedwig's Cathedral in Berlin, publicly prayed for Jews and other persecuted groups. Arrested in 1941, he died en route to Dachau concentration camp in 1943. Labor resistance represented a particular challenge for the Nazi regime, which needed industrial production for its war effort. Despite the destruction of independent unions in 1933, workers found ways to express opposition through absenteeism, deliberate slowdowns, and quality sabotage. The regime responded with increasing surveillance in factories, including the placement of Nazi informants on production lines. Despite these measures, industrial sabotage remained common enough to warrant regular crackdowns and exemplary punishments. What unites these various forms of resistance is the extraordinary moral courage they required. Resistors acted knowing that discovery meant almost certain death, often preceded by torture. They acted without reasonable hope of success in the conventional sense. They acted despite seeing the majority of their fellow citizens either supporting the regime or remaining passive. Their stories remind us that even the most effective system of repression cannot completely eliminate the human capacity for moral choice. Throughout the 12 years of Nazi rule, there were always Germans willing to risk everything to oppose Hitler's tyranny, a fact that complicates simplistic narratives about German compliance with the regime. These acts of resistance, though ultimately unsuccessful in overthrowing Hitler, served several crucial functions. They maintained alternative moral traditions that could be drawn upon in rebuilding German society after 1945. They provided critical intelligence to Allied forces. Perhaps most importantly, they preserved the possibility of a different Germany, one defined by ethical principles rather than racial ideology and brute power. The courage of these resistors poses challenging questions for contemporary citizens of democratic societies. If these individuals were willing to risk execution to oppose tyranny, what level of courage might reasonably be expected from citizens who face much less severe consequences for defending democratic principles? Central to Hitler's elimination of political rivals was the Gestapo, the secret state police with virtually unlimited power to arrest, detain, and interrogate anyone suspected of political crimes. Contrary to popular perception, the Gestapo was not an enormous organization. At its peak, it employed only about 32,000 officers for a population of 80 million, a ratio that would make comprehensive surveillance impossible under normal circumstances. What made the Gestapo extraordinarily effective was its cultivation of informal informants. Neighbors reported neighbors. Colleagues informed on co-workers. Even family members sometimes denounced relatives for expressing political dissent. Studies of Gestapo case files after the war revealed that approximately 80% of all investigations began with denunciations from ordinary citizens rather than active police work. This created a society where people assumed they were being watched at all times, even when they weren't. The psychological impact was profound. Germans began to self-censor not just in public, but in private conversations. Political discussion disappeared from daily life. Even those who harbored doubts about the regime kept them hidden, creating an illusion of consensus that reinforced Hitler's power. This combination, a relatively small but brutally efficient secret police force amplified by a culture of denunciation, created one of history's most effective systems for suppressing political opposition. The Gestapo's effectiveness stemmed partly from its legal position within the Nazi state. Unlike previous German police agencies, it operated outside normal judicial constraints. The basic law for the protection of the people and state, issued after the Reichstag fire, had suspended constitutional protections against arbitrary arrest and detention. This gave the Gestapo effectively unlimited power to detain anyone deemed politically dangerous. Under the leadership of Reinhard Heydrich and later Heinrich Müller, the Gestapo developed sophisticated methods for tracking and eliminating political opposition. They maintained extensive card files on suspected opponents, with detailed information on political backgrounds, associates, and activities. These files were continuously updated through interrogations, informant reports, and mail surveillance. The Gestapo's interrogation methods became legendary for their brutality. While they employed sophisticated psychological techniques to extract information, physical torture was common. The enhanced interrogation at Gestapo headquarters often included beatings with rubber truncheons, water torture, and stress positions. The Columbia House in Berlin, an early Gestapo detention center, became particularly notorious for the screams that emanated from its basement interrogation rooms. What made the Gestapo particularly effective was its strategic use of terror. Not everyone was targeted. The goal wasn't mass arrests, but rather using targeted brutality to intimidate the broader population. A single disappearance in a factory or apartment building could silence dozens or hundreds of others. The system of denunciation that developed under Nazi rule reveals disturbing aspects of human psychology. Many informants weren't ideological Nazis, but ordinary citizens who reported others for personal gain, revenge, or simply to demonstrate their own loyalty to the regime. In many cases, denunciations stemmed from workplace rivalries or personal grievances. A 1935 Gestapo report noted that approximately 37% of denunciations appeared motivated by personal conflicts rather than political concerns. Someone passed over for promotion might report their supervisor for an offhand political comment. Neighbors in disputes over property lines might report each other for defeatist statements. The Nazi legal system incentivized such behavior. The 1933 law against malicious attacks on state and party made it a crime to fail to report treasonous statements. This created a legal obligation to inform on others. Failure to do so could itself be prosecuted. The effectiveness of this system can be measured in how thoroughly it suppressed political discussion. Germans developed what they called face poker, Gesichtspoker, maintaining a neutral expression regardless of one's true feelings about news or political developments. Even in private, many families avoided political discussions entirely, fearing that children might innocently repeat parents' comments at school.